Welcome to the Legatum Institute, to this event organized by CABU. I'm Michael Binion. I'm a former journalist for the Times newspaper. And we have with us, as you know, Marwan Al-Muasher, who will be talking about his very interesting book, The Second Arab Awakening. We'll probably talk for about 40 minutes, and I hope that will give us plenty of time for questions. Let me just briefly outline what CABU and the Legatum Institute both do. CABU, since 1967, has taken a strong political, education, and media role. It's a cross-party organization with chairs from all the main political parties. CABU works to advance Arab-British relations through its support for international law, human rights, and democracy. And the Legatum Institute, where we are now, is an independent, non-partisan public policy organization whose research, publications, and programs advance ideas and policies in support of free and prosperous societies around the world. Now, one thing you can do to support CABU is to sign up to its mailing list, and that will keep you informed about CABU's work and future events. And this event will be live streamed, and a video of the conversation will be available afterwards. You have, I think, these little cards which give the Twitter and hashtag Wi-Fi name and all the other technological things one needs to know. Now, in welcoming Marwan Al-Muasher, we welcome the Vice President for Studies at Carnegie Endowment, where he oversees research in Washington and Beirut on the Middle East. Mr. Al-Muasher has served as Foreign Minister from 2002 to 2004 and Deputy Prime Minister 2004 to 2005 in Jordan. And his career has spanned the areas of diplomacy, development, civil society, and communications. He began his career as a journalist, sounds a fine start, for the Jordan Times, and served in the Ministry of Planning as the Prime Minister's office as press advisor and as director of the Jordan Information Bureau in Washington. And in 1995, he opened Jordan's first embassy in Israel. And in 1996, became Minister of Information and Government spokesperson. From 1997 to 2002, he served in Washington again as ambassador, negotiating the first free trade agreement between the United States and an Arab nation. Returning to Jordan to serve as foreign minister, he then played a central role in developing the Arab Peace Initiative and the Middle East Roadmap. In 2004, he became Deputy Prime Minister responsible for reform and government performance and led the effort to produce a 10-year plan for political, economic, and social reform. From 2006 to 2007, he was a member of the Jordanian Senate. And from 2007 to 2010, he was Senior Vice President of External Affairs at the World Bank. Well, one couldn't get a more brilliant CV for writing this book, or a more qualified view of all the things that we're going to be discussing. So maybe I could start, Marwan, straight away and ask you about, first of all, why you called the book The Second Arab Awakening, and how you see this awakening now, as opposed to a couple of years ago.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I call it the Second Arab Awakening because there was a first one, the first liberal era in the contemporary world of the Middle East. Took place starting in the mid-19th century when a group of uncoordinated intellectuals in countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, started talking about the need to be exposed to the outside world, to get rid of Ottoman rule, and then later on of colonial rule. It started as an intellectual movement, if you will, that later made its way into popular movements for independence. And where the first one failed, in my view, is that it has stopped at independence. Once independence was achieved, no Arab country had any serious effort exerted in building democratic and pluralistic societies, whether whether you had monarchies or republics, progressive or what we used to call reactionary states. It didn't matter. Everybody did not give pluralism any attention. And I argue in this book that if the Second Arab Awakening is to be successful, and we don't know yet if it will be successful, it has to result not just in deposing despotic rulers, but also in building democratic societies and finally giving pluralism what it needs, the attention that it needs as an operating system that would ensure prosperous and stable societies.
Do you think the West was premature in dubbing the events that began in Tunisia as the Arab Spring?
The West has been premature on two counts, in my view. First, in calling it an Arab Spring. Again, romantically expecting, the end of autocracies to result immediately in democracy, something which has never happened anywhere else in the world. No other historical process has unfolded in 3 short years. But then in calling it an Arab winter today, most people also today think that the Arab world is doomed to failure, is doomed to an era of darkness. And I think both characterizations are equally simplistic. The fact is that the Arab world has been living under a state of artificially induced stability. It was not natural stability, it was stability mostly produced or brought about by brute force. And now that the lid has been opened, naturally the challenges that lay below the surface are going to come out, and they are not going to be settled in 3 short years. They're also not going to be settled successfully everywhere. Even though it is an Arab world, it is not a monolithic world. And we're going to see some countries succeed, some countries struggle, and others fail. Much like, let's say the process that happened in Eastern Europe, where 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you see countries such as Poland doing much better than countries such as Romania. This is a historical process that needs to one, take its time, and then one that depends on what people do with it. If people want democratic societies, they have to work at once. Democracy will not grow on trees and will not come about by wishful thinking.
You will look in your book at a number of countries and how they have fared since 2011, and you look particularly at Tunisia, where I think you are cautiously optimistic there. You also spend quite a lot of time, I think absolutely rightly, because it's so important, talking about Egypt. But unfortunately, everything changed just a few months after you had more or less written the bulk of the book. So I wonder whether, in looking back now at what has happened in Egypt, you would be perhaps slightly gloomier than you were in the book, where you were hoping that some of the lessons of moderation were being learnt or would be learnt by the Muslim Brotherhood. It does look as though they are really right out of the picture at the moment. How do you see things moving in Egypt?
Well, if you look at, you mentioned 2 very interesting models that offer quite contrasting models for transition to the rest of the Arab world. Tunisia has adopted an inclusionist model, a model where all forces of society participated in a coalition government, a model where the Tunisians agreed that the first order of business is a constitution writing process that would ensure that all parties, all forces have a place in the system. And in 3 very difficult years in Tunisia, and Tunisia certainly is not out of the woods, and there's a lot of work to be done. But after 3 difficult years, you today have a constitution in Tunisia which upholds the right of all men and women in society, equal parity for men and women, peaceful rotation of power at all times, and for the first time in the Arab world, upholding the right to believe or not to believe. This is agreed to not by the secular forces only, but also by the Islamists. So Tunisia is already offering a model of what a successful transition might look like by including all forces in society, rather than the Egyptian model, which basically pits secular forces against Islamist forces in a winner-take-all strategy. So whoever wins the elections, becomes the new dictator of Egypt. When the Islamists won the elections last year, they behaved in a majoritarian way. They pushed through a constitution that did not enjoy the consensus of all forces of society. And they monopolized power. The presidency, the prime ministry and government, the parliament was all dominated by the Islamists. And they paid the price for it. Because after a transition, and experience around the world shows that, no matter who rules after a transition, it takes an average of 5 years for all major economic indicators to go back to the pre-transition level. Because transitions are about instability. And instability takes time before things settle down. So you have an inclusionist, then you have the secular forces in Egypt, and let's not, absolve the secular forces also of their mistakes. The secular forces that accuse the Islamists of coming to power and then monopolizing it are doing exactly the same today in Egypt. Today the Islamists are a terrorist organization, all their leaders are in prison, and the secular forces are again behaving in a winner-take-all strategy. That is not a model that I think will offer a way forward for Egypt. And as I keep saying, in a zero-sum game, the sum usually is zero. Two contrasting models for the rest of the Arab world. One is on its way to recovery, one is still in bad shape.
I think you very clearly pointed out in the book the particular circumstances of each of the countries you look at, and I think it's fairly clear that if the developments in Tunisia won't work, they won't work anywhere. I mean, they had the best possible starting point, both economically and in terms of social cohesion and in terms of their quite high level of education, whereas Egypt, with a tremendous amount of poverty, a feeling of hopelessness, a sort of very large population looking mostly underemployed. How do you think the forces there will play out, in the sense that the economy is clearly going to dominate whatever happens when Sisi comes to power? And do you think we're doomed to replay this same cycle of hopes followed by disillusion, followed by repression?
I think we're coming to a phase not just in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world, where ideologies, pure ideologies, are on the decline. The pure ideologies of pan-Arabism, of Nasserism, of Baathism, of other isms in the 20th century did not produce stable and prosperous societies, because they kept talking about ideology without a clear socio-economic program. And then the Islamists did the same. After the defeat in '67, the Islamists, put forward their famous slogan, "Islam is the solution." But it was just a slogan. And they did not have to prove what that slogan means, because they were artificially kept out of the system by Arab governments. Once the Islamists came to power, in one short year in Egypt and Tunisia, they did more to weaken themselves than 50 or 60 or 70 years of exclusion by Arab governments have done to them. Islam is the solution today is far less attractive, not just in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world, than it was 3 years ago. And so you're absolutely right. The economy, in my view, is going to be the determinant factor for any emerging force in the Arab world. If emerging forces are all about pure ideologies and nothing else, they will not succeed. People want jobs. If you look at the polls in Egypt, they're very clear. Whereas 90% of Egyptians identify themselves as conservative and religious, 90%. 2% want their government to worry about ideology. 70% want the government to worry about the economy.
Yes.
So the message is very clear. We know how to be Muslims. We don't need the government to tell us how to be Muslims. What we need the government to do is create jobs and, improve our economic lot. Sisi, if he, attempts to rule alone, as events suggest he will, he will also pay the price. And I doubt that in a year or two, when people look at their economic conditions, and if they have not improved, I doubt that Sisi will retain the kind of popularity he does. But I'm still not overly worried about Egypt. Egypt is a homogeneous society. Egypt has a civil society, the oldest bureaucracy in the Arab world. It's a society that I think in the end, who was it? I think Churchill, who said that politicians do the right thing after they exhaust all other possibilities. And Egyptians might exhaust all other possibilities, but in the end, they have enough of the necessary ingredients in their society to make it. Tunisia is already, I think, far ahead of Egypt in that department.
You look at some very interesting factors beneath the surface, beneath the daily headlines, and I wonder how you see these affecting developments not only in Egypt but in the Arab world in particular. I mean, two things in particular. The first is, as you've already mentioned, the mentality zero-sum game, the mentality of winner takes all, the idea that whoever comes into power uses the power to bolster, solidify their position, and basically exclude their perceived enemies or whoever. And that seems to lead inevitably to a swing backwards and forwards, a sort of seesaw. You're either in or you're out, and then you get the reverse coming again. And this leads you on into a very interesting discussion of a flawed education system where the possibility of argument or of doubt or of questioning received authority doesn't exist. So that when somebody comes into power believing they are right, they would expect a younger generation to learn and to be brought up in the idea that this is the right way of doing things and not to question. Now, those two deeply held mental kind of parameters would seem to me to make breaking out of this possibility, breaking out of the kind of endless seesaw, pretty difficult.
Well, if, again, one is to develop pluralistic societies, there are no shortcuts. And one has to work at not just building institutions over a long period of time, but education reform, in my view, is one of the central ingredients that need to be looked at if the Arab world is to move to, appreciate the very rich diversity of the Arab world. We're a very diverse region, religiously, ethnically, in all aspects. There's a richness that is not appreciated, nor celebrated in the Arab world. We have an education system that has taught us basically to think monolithically, not to think outside the box, to treat all truths as absolute and not relative, not to question authority, not to have any kind of critical thinking. And unfortunately, there has been what I believe was an unwritten alliance between the two central forces in the Arab world in the last century. The secular elites who have ruled much of the Arab world and the religious opposition, who basically united to keep an educational system that was designed to produce docile societies that do not question their interpretation of the truth, whether that truth was secular or religious. Of course, what happened was exactly the opposite. What was produced were frustrated societies, not being able to compete in today's global marketplace. And as a result, we have seen what happened. People went to the streets. Now, how do you convince governments, particularly those that have not undergone transition, how do you convince them that if they want to remain stable, they have to teach the new generation how to question what they preach? Is not easy.
How can you do it? How can you possibly change that mentality?
I think you need to start working from the ground up. I mean, I think that I personally have almost lost hope that the old generation in the Arab world, my generation and those even before me, whether secular or religious, are capable of democratic practices. We have seen this in a very stark way in Egypt. we have seen intellectuals, we have seen civil society, we have seen secular forces practice what I call selective democracy. They're Democrats as long as the result is to their liking. As long as the result agrees with their own thinking, then they're Democrats. If the result is not to their liking, then they have no problem, aligning with the military and practicing exactly the kind of things that they accuse their opponents of doing. We cannot build a pluralistic society, a stable society with forces like this. That is why I place, most of my emphasis and focus and hope on a new generation. Not because young age is a determinant necessarily of a commitment to, democratic norms, but because the new generation is at least not as contaminated by the practices of their parents. And there is enough of a critical mass that you can work with. But again, this is going to take decades. There's a study by Booz Allen that shows that if Saudi Arabia does everything right on education, on changing the education system in their country, it will take 45 years for results to be seen.
Wow.
So anybody who thinks this is a short or a smooth process, better think again. That does not mean that people should be in despair, as I said. I think that this is a process that should have started right after independence and did not. So we lost 70, 80 valuable years, but at least it has started now, and the battle for ideas has started. I call the book The Battle for Pluralism, not to say that it is already won, but to, as a call to arms that we need to start this battle, not just to end despotic rule, as I said, but to build better and pluralistic societies.
Do you think that some societies are possible, it is possible to have reform from top down? You look particularly at, the monarchies, Morocco and Jordan, which have been fairly adept in sort of stepping around some of the bigger pitfalls, and there have been apparent attempts to try to produce reform ahead of the street, to ward off trouble on the street. You also mentioned the Gulf, where they haven't actually done very much apart from pay to try to head off trouble. But is it possible you could have enlightened rulers who will begin to make modifications and changes from above? And if so, will that stick?
Ironically, as you said, the countries that have not undergone transition, most of them belong to the monarchies of the Arab world. There are 8 monarchies, of course, 6 rich monarchies of the Gulf, if you consider Bahrain rich, and the 2 poor monarchies of Jordan and Morocco. Now, indeed, in the rich monarchies, many of these monarchies, led by Saudi Arabia, are not happy about the process of change and are using their financial resources to actually either stop or reverse the process. What they're doing in Egypt, what they're doing domestically, suggests that. I think that is not sustainable, that without them also putting in place a reform process, which is not glacial. I mean, a lot of people argue correctly that reform from above should be gradual so that you don't end up having the turmoil of countries as Egypt and Tunisia did. And I totally agree with that. But gradual cannot be synonymous with glacial. Gradual should be synonymous or accompanied with seriousness. So if you have a gradual but serious reform process that ends up redistributing power between the 3 branches of government, then that's a serious reform process, which in my view has not been even attempted in the Gulf. In the poor monarchies of Jordan and Morocco, these are monarchies that have legitimacy in the eyes of their people. King Abdullah in Jordan and the monarchy are not in doubt. The major ethnic groups in the country, the East Jordanians and the Palestinians, want the king to serve as an arbiter. They don't even want him to be a constitutional monarch in the British sense, for example. They do want him to be an arbiter. But having said so, they want the monarchy to evolve, and they want serious changes to happen within the monarchy. What we have seen in places like Jordan and Morocco is that the system has built, formidable layers around it in a patronage system where loyalty is exchanged for privileges. And once the monarch attempts to, supervise, lead a process from above, he will find himself, and I think that is the situation that King Abdullah is in today, he will find himself caught between, a need to evolve the system because the status quo is not sustainable, and resistance from the traditional constituency that the system itself helped build, but a constituency whose privileges have been given to them for a very long time and who are not ready to give up these privileges, even gradually over time. And so it's always a delicate balance for a country like Jordan. I'm one of the people who think that we have not been we have not been moving as fast as we can on reform. And I think that the traditional constituency around the regime has been extremely resilient in fighting any serious moves towards reform. You mentioned the national agenda, an effort that King Abdullah initiated in 2005. That effort practically was torpedoed not by the opposition, but by his own people who were afraid to lose their privileges.
Where do you think the future of Islamism lies? I mean, in your book, you do argue that it would be very foolish simply to demonize them or to think that the religious element can be removed from politics. It's here to stay. But after what we've seen in Egypt, and particularly after we've seen this visceral fear in Saudi Arabia of a religious-based opposition force, where do you think Islamism will go throughout the Middle East?
I argued in the book, and I think I was proven right, that we have seen the peak of support for the Islamists. I say that because Islamists have been strengthened by Arab governments, by keeping them outside the systems. As such, as I said, they were able to promise anything and not having to put these promises to the test. Today, Islamists have lost their holiness in the Arab world. Today, it is no longer sort of taboo, sacrilegious, whatever you want to say, to criticize the Islamists in the way that people were afraid to only 3 years ago. Just as the secular forces lost their holiness also, it was also taboo and sacrilegious to criticize Arab governments until the Arab uprisings. Today, that element of fear is gone. And that is one of the most positive developments of the Arab uprisings, in my view. That from now on, it is not secular or religious ideology that will determine whether governments are popular or not in the Middle East. It is results. Those who can deliver on economic results are the ones that will be on top. Those who keep talking about reform or talking about ideology and not deliver will suffer. The Islamists in the Arab world, if they keep talking about Islam as a solution only and not translate that into specific programs, will not be popular or as popular as they used to be in the past. And I think events, not just in Egypt, but also in Tunisia, are proving it. A lot of people will argue that we had a coup in Egypt, and that the military coup is what brought the Islamists down. But a lot of people forget what is today happening in Tunisia. Tunisia is a country where the military has not interfered, has kept totally neutral, and yet the Islamist force, Al-Nahda in Tunisia, is actually losing popular support. Not to the point where they will disappear. Of course, they're still the number one or the number two force in the country, but there are other secular forces today, Nida Tunis and Al-Nahda, who, as the polls suggest, will probably win the elections if the elections are held tomorrow morning. And if that happens, it will be the first time in the Arab world where Islamists will not have only come to power but left it through the ballot box. Of course, that is the main worry of the secular elements in the Arab world. They keep saying that Islamists will not leave power once they come to it.
Yes, one man, one vote, one time.
Yeah, but it's a very disingenuous argument, because tell me about an secular Arab government who has left power once it got to it.
Yes.
So we've got to, from now on, treat everybody according to the same yardstick, whether they are Islamists or secular forces. The power of the ballot box must be respected from now on. And I think that is something else that needs to be done in the Arab world. We need new social compacts. We need new social contracts between the government and the old ones that govern much of the Arab world after independence, have exhausted their possibilities. We need a new social contract where this, a certain certain bill of rights, if you want, is respected by everybody, to define the rules of the game so that you can move forward with assurance. That is something the Tunisians have been able to do, and that bodes well for others to do the same.
Can we look at the three players who are sort of partly bystanders, but also actually very key to the whole thing, which are the non-Arab elements, the West, Israel, and Turkey? Now, you're quite critical of Western policy taking a wrong attitude and therefore pushing things in the wrong direction by overreacting. You're also very critical of the Israelis for simply sitting back and doing nothing and thinking that they don't need to make any movement on the peace process because things will just carry on as they are. And it's better to just sit tight. You don't say much about Turkey, but Turkey at the moment seems to have got itself into a terrible tangle over its attitude to Syria in particular. And in the end, we'll have to talk about Syria and the awfulness there. But let's, for the moment, just talk about the three outside players. How do you see their reactions affecting things?
Well, the West for a long time, implemented a policy of stability over reform. In other words, they prioritized stability in the Arab world over any reform elements. And so the people who were stable governments were moderate towards one issue, which is the peace process, were called moderate by the West, let's say Saudi Arabia or Egypt, regardless of their internal domestic issues. Moving to a policy of supporting stability through reform is not going to be an easy thing for the West. The West does have interest, but I still think this is the way the West should go. At any rate, I don't think that the reform process in the Arab world is going to be affected in any major way by other than domestic internal considerations. The West can help by supporting the process, not individuals, not picking winners and losers as it has in the past, by doing no harm, and leave the rest to a process that is evolutionary and will evolve over time in a way that is largely independent, in my view, of outside factors. Israel is in very bad shape today, in my view.
Not economically.
Not economically. You remind me of a joke of somebody who slipped from the 10th floor of a building, and on his way down meets somebody at the balcony of the second floor. And the guy on the balcony of the second floor sees this guy falling down. He says, "How is it going?" And the guy says, "So far, so good." That's the situation Israel, I think, is in today. It is in a false sense of security because it's doing very well economically, because it has built a wall around itself and thinks it can, live perpetually in isolation of its neighbors. And yet, it is the longest occupation in the modern history, today probably the only occupation in the contemporary world, it is facing a situation where demographically the number of Arabs and Jews living under Israel's control in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel are exactly the same. 6 million Arabs to 6 million Jews. The demographic factor can no longer be ignored or postponed. It is with us today, which means that if Israel does not actively work for a two-state solution, which many people will tell you is already dead, I'm one of them. But if we don't have such a solution, then I don't see how Israel can hope to survive in the long run as a Jewish and democratic state without giving the Palestinians a viable state of their own. Today you ask any Israeli leader in government, and they have no answer on what is their long-term strategy if there is no two-state solution. On Turkey has, I don't want to be too simplistic, but we've heard a lot about the Turkish model and whether a Turkish model is relevant to the Arab world. Frankly, most of that talk came from Turkey itself rather than from the Arab world.
And from Erdogan in particular.
Absolutely. I mean, let's remember, and Turkey has done a lot of good things, but let's remember, and so this is not a value statement, but let's remember that Turkey for the longest time, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, was not looked at through friendly eyes by Arabs. This was a country that abandoned the Arabic language, abandoned the caliphate, became secular, looked to the West, became friends with Israel. I mean, did all the wrong things from an Arab perspective. When the Erdogan government came 10 years ago or 12 years ago and advocated a policy of zero problems with the neighbors and a policy of rapprochement with the Arab world, things improved. But things largely improved, and Mr. Erdogan is a popular person in the Arab world today, not because of the Turkish governance model, but because of his stance vis-a-vis Israel. I don't think that the Turkish model of governance, and you have to parse that model. What do we mean by that model? Is it total separation of church and state? Is it the role of the army? Is it the economic model? I mean, there are so many issues that need to be looked at. But today Turkey is finding itself in a position where it has problems with all its neighbors, none excluded, and with a prime minister who is behaving increasingly
erratically.
And so it's a bit premature to talk about a Turkish influence that was perceived a few months.
The only thing is that your argument for pluralism and your argument for accepting the result of change, that you allow others to come in, you have an alternation of power. I mean, that to some extent has been the Turkish model with quite a few ups and downs on the way, but that is the thing that they have largely succeeded in doing, and therefore I wonder if you would like an Arab
they
nation
succeeded in doing that. They succeeded in creating, in developing an economic position where today they're the 16th, 17th largest economy in the world. They succeeded in their business community becoming somewhat independent of government, which is not the case in the Arab world. Most of the business community in the Arab world are aligned with the state, so they are status quo forces rather than forces for change. So they have done, of course, a lot of things that are good. All I'm suggesting is that for the Arab world, it is a bit early to tell whether they're going to make use of the Turkish model. They're not thinking in these terms yet, as much as the Turks themselves are.
Yes. And I think we have to talk about Syria. We have to ask, is the appalling bloodshed there and the polarization and the fraction, the sort of breaking up of so many communities, is this going to bring down all the other hopes that went with the whole idea of a second Arab awakening?
Syria is an example of a country in the Levant, in the eastern part of the Arab world, that was artificially created by, some of your ancestors.
Indeed. Well, certainly Mr. Sykes. Mr. Picot is French.
Yes, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Where people from different ethnic and religious groups were artificially put in the same country, not just in Syria, but in Iraq, in Lebanon. But the 100 years that separate us from, and they're almost 100 years, that separate us from Sykes-Picot have not been invested by Arab governments in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in forging national identities that would trump any other sub-identity. That is becoming a very central issue in the Levant, I think. Today, a Kurd in Syria will think of himself or herself as a Kurd before they would think of themselves as a Syrian. Same would apply to, Christian Maronite and Alawite, the list goes on. And as a result, we've seen multiple wars in Lebanon. We've seen the chaos that we do in Iraq. And of course, a horrific war in Syria. It is therefore, I think, countries like Syria, even if the war stops tomorrow morning, are going to take an awfully long time before they recover. Not just because of the economic destruction, but because you really have to rebuild the whole notion of a state and what it means to be a citizen. The whole notion of citizenship today needs to be revisited in the Arab world. Most countries treated their citizens as subjects rather than citizens. What does it mean to be a citizen? And, if I'm a Shiite in Saudi Arabia and I'm given equal rights, would I be part of the state, or would I look to outside forces such as Iran, for example? These are all questions that can no longer be swept under the carpet. We would have to look at all these concepts, men and women, okay? If you want to build prosperous societies, but yet you allow yourself to treat women as less equal than men, then you also allow yourself to treat Shiites as less equal than Sunnis. Then you also allow yourself to treat Christians as less equal than Muslims, etc. These whole concepts today have to be revisited. And I think in the Levant, the citizenship issue is at the forefront, at the top of these concepts that will have to be revisited. Now, going back to Syria, you have a brutal leader who is stopping at nothing to stay in power. Over 150,000 people killed. The uprising started without doubt in a peaceful way, stayed peaceful for a few months. So this argument about it being a sectarian, issue only is not completely accurate. Of course, everybody makes use of the security vacuum. Al-Qaeda used it in Iraq, as you remember. But I do not think that the Syrian population in general are radical and would offer either the Sunni Al-Qaeda types or the Shiite Hezbollah types the kind of environment that would allow them to eventually rule over Syria. I don't think that will happen. I also don't think we are going to see any quick solution to the problem. And, no one can win this war. Assad cannot rule over all of Syria, either militarily, morally, or otherwise. And the opposition is too disunited and weak to also rule over all of Syria. And without any outside intervention, I'm afraid that we're going to keep looking at a brutal stalemate in which more people will die, in which neighboring countries such as Jordan, Lebanon will continue to pay a huge price in the number of Syrian refugees coming to their shores, etc.
It's a sobering thought, but you've raised some extremely important questions on not only citizenship, but the religion, in fact, the whole range of things we've talked about already. It's all wonderfully contained in the book, which you will find on sale downstairs. We now have some time left for questions. So let's start, yes, straight away right here.
Thank you very much, Michael Hosni, ma'am, journalist.
Come here.
Yes, yeah. Do we have a roving mic, maybe? Yes, could you give it to Hosni?
Thank you very much. Hosni, ma'am, journalist. Warmly welcome
Is it on?
here, Mr. Al-Muasher, and with your deep knowledge and insight of the Arab world and the Jordanian experience about the Muslim Brotherhood and your overall assessment of that situation, whether in Egypt or Tunisia or wherever. Don't you agree that the main cardinal mistake made by Egypt was to allow the toxic mix between politics and religion? We have seen it in Jordan, we have seen it in Egypt. Maybe Tunisia is a different experience, more adaptable, and this should not have happened at all, and this is what brought us the mess we are in up at the moment. Secondly, I'll be very frank with you, Egypt is not a democracy. Now, it is trying to be a democratic, so judging it by the democratic norms and standards is a total fallacy with respect. And any new ruler in Egypt would have to tackle one and only basic problem, the economy, as you rightly suggested. The country is in turmoil as a result of the fact that there are people holding the gun to the heads of other people, and you cannot be inclusive in this process like that. And
can you keep the question fairly short?
Sisi and the others would love to have this inclusive approach you are talking about, but you cannot hold the people ransom after 7,000 years of secularism in Egypt and having 15 million Copts and tell me that you want to mix religion with politics. I think we have to reassess this. Thank you.
I'm not suggesting you mix religion with politics. I'm suggesting that you cannot deny the right of forces that have, popular support in the country. You cannot deny them the right to operate, because the minute you allow yourself to exclude others, you will allow others to exclude you. That to me is very simple. One cannot be a selective Democrat. I'm fiercely secular myself, fiercely secular. I don't personally believe religion has any role in politics. But my views are not the views of the overwhelming majority of my people. And to say that just because I'm fiercely secular, I'm going to deny anybody who disagrees with my point of view from operating in the country, I think is extremely dangerous and short-sighted.
It depends on what
it's extremely, that's my view.
Let's leave it there, because we've got lots of questions. The lady over there, yes.
Let me just, before, if you can,
yeah.
Let me just, you raise an issue which has been debated in the Arab world for a long time. This issue of let's worry about the economy first, then we worry about political inclusion. The bread before freedom argument. And that argument, actually, that policy has been attempted in the past. It's not like you're asking Sisi to do it as if Egypt has not done it before. Egypt has tried economic reform for the last 20, well, they have tried. Tunisia has tried very seriously. Jordan has tried very seriously. Jordan is a country that has joined the WTO, signed a free trade agreement with the United States, privatized all its state industries, liberalized its trade systems, signed a partnership agreement with Europe. I mean, did everything under the sun economically. But yet we have, you don't have much to show for it. Today the budget deficit is 15% in Jordan. The debt to the GDP ratio is 80%. Unemployment is 14%, double the world's average, etc.
No resources.
No, it's not no resources. It's because the economic reform process in the Arab world has not been coupled with the political reform process. To build a system of checks and balances balances so that when abuses take place, somebody checks them. Today, economic reform in the Arab world is not associated with improving people's lives. It's associated with corruption. And so, this argument that we have to worry about the economy first, then the time will come to worry about politics, has been tried and failed miserably.
We've got the lady there. Let's take two at a time because we've got so many questions. And gentleman there, yes, you do first, and then you, and then we'll do two at a time.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me the chance. In fact, you have mentioned that Islamists really failed to present pluralistic even, like the Baathism, like the Nasserism, and yet you are still praising the Nahda and the Tunisian model. I think the right model, and Tunisia has really copied and really were frightened from what was happening to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. That's why they have applied some beautification to their constitution to keep getting some finance and aids from abroad, but still Tunisia not stable and not quite yet stable. We have here really heard about assassination and killing, and the secular people there are really revolting, are unhappy with the Muslim and Nahda over there. So it's not the model. I think the right model is Egypt, because we have beaten about the bush. We know exactly what we want. We really pay the price. I'm telling the truth. We pay the price, but will be the right model for the Middle East. Thank you.
And the gentleman there.
A model in which you imprison all your opposition, to me, does not strike me as the right model. Does not strike me as the right model.
Can you keep the questions slightly shorter? Otherwise, we won't get in. You ask one as well.
Sure.
Yes.
Hi.
We'll take.
Is this on? Okay. I really enjoyed reading your book. I had a great exploring some of the concepts. And I wanted to just toy with one of the concepts that you raised here. It's from the Gallup report, I believe, on Egypt, where it says 47% of the population thought that Sharia must be the only source of legislation, while 46% believe that Sharia must be a source of legislation. And I found it fascinating, your discussion about the education system. Being half Egyptian myself, I look at my cousins who take the Sanawiyya Amma, and it's just a memorization exam. There's no critical thinking. And the rich heritage that Islam as a religion has in critical thinking that we've lost. To what extent do you think that there needs to be a pluralistic movement within theology, within the culture of theology, even Islam being the medium of discussion? To what extent there needs to be a pluralistic movement in that circle before it trickles down philosophically to whether Islamist, political Islam, which I think in many ways is devoid of Islamic ethics. I think that's the great problem with political Islam in these days, or even pluralism from the secular point of view.
Look, nobody has a monopoly on the truth, whether they're secular or religious. Sheikh Rifa'at Tahtawi in Egypt, as far back as 1825, was talking about exactly the kind of notions that you are talking about, pluralism in theology. He traveled to France for a few years and talked about the need of Egyptian society to be exposed to French society. 1825, okay? And there are others. Muhammad Abdu was the Sheikh of Azhar. Okay, he talked about separation of church from state, and he was the Sheikh of Azhar. So there's nothing that prevents people from talking about pluralism in theology. This is a new concept in the 20th century, where the door to ijtihad and theological reasoning has been closed. But it was not like this throughout history, and it doesn't have to be this for eternity. The second point I want to make is, for Islamist parties, what does it mean to be an Islamist party? Which interpretation of Islam are we talking about? There are so many. Are we talking about the four Sunni madhahib? Are we talking about the Shiite madhahib? What are we talking about when we talk about Islam? There is no such thing, in my view, as a pure Islamist party. There are, parties who advocate a certain interpretation of Islam, and they're entitled to it as long as they don't, force it on other trends. But to say to people, I will not allow you to do this, is a, in my view, is a formula for disaster. Once again, if you allow yourself to exclude any group, you allow that group to exclude you once they come to power. This is not a formula to build pluralistic societies.
It's better for survival, sir.
I'm sorry, sir. I just don't believe in this at all. I'm sorry. I mean, I totally, fundamentally disagree with any force that is exclusionist and will not allow others to operate. Fundamentally disagree with this.
Let's take two more. Right here, and then gentleman there. Yes. Well, you first, and then you.
Yeah.
Keep them short. We'll try and get another 6 or 7 questions in.
Thank you, Mr. Marwan. And I would like to ask about the American policy in Syria. Do you think the American policy in Syria is doing good or bad for the beginning of the revolution? And what about the Syrian people? I mean, the Syrian people pay a lot of heavy price for that. Do you think the American, they make a wrong decision by staying this long, or keep policy is very weak, like Obama, he's very weak in Syria. So what do you think the solution, the future solution for Syria?
Okay, and the one there? Yes, yours.
Hi. Okay, Dr. Marwan, thank you. This is really refreshing and a fresh air for a change. My question to you is with regards to the operating system that remains to be intact, although it was challenged, in the form of the governance crises we saw, which is the social contract you referred to. Of course, education and meaningful education change would be the right course of action, but that's just one part of the answer, and it's a long-term one. What are some of the other sort of dynamics that we should be promoting to try and reach to another social contract that basically rewards or nurtures the pluralistic societies that we want to help achieve? Thanks.
Sure.
On Syria, I think to understand American policy or lack of policy on Syria, one has to look at the Iraq War of 2003. The Americans went to war in 2003, having been told by George Bush that this was going to be a cost-free war, that all the war would be paid by the resources of the region or Iraq, that this was a war against weapons of mass destruction, and that this was a war to put democracy in the Arab world. But none of the three proved to be right. According to the most conservative estimates, the war has cost the Americans so far $2 trillion. Some people, Joe Stiglitz puts it at $5 or $6 trillion. No weapons of mass destruction were found, and no democracy was installed in the country. And so Americans had a very sort of negative reaction as a result of that war, elected a president who ran partly on the platform of withdrawing from the region, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, not of intervening militarily again. Whether one agrees or not with that policy, it's a fact of life that 85% of the American public do not want to be involved in Syria. And that this president, is not acting on his own impulse. He is acting based on a very solid public constituency that does not want him to be involved. On what can be done other than education, I agree education is certainly not the only thing. I still maintain that the best chance lies with countries that have not undergone transition if their leadership understands that the only way forward is to share the power and to do it in a smooth way and to put in place institutions, as I said, over time. Unfortunately, that's not being done, in my view. We are seeing a lull in the Arab world today because naturally people are afraid to go the route of Egypt or to go the route of Syria. And as a result, a lot of the leaders of the region, instead of using that lull to put in place a process under calm conditions, are interpreting this lull to mean that the problems are over and they don't have to do much.
Couple more. Yes, one here, and then the lady there. Yes. Oh, and then, okay, next time round.
Alistair MacDonald Rapt of the King Abdullah Dialogue Centre, Anglican priest as well. I just wanted to say that while the importance, the vital nature of pluralism to the future of the region is clearly a case that is very compelling, and everyone, I think, sees that as something of hope, the evidence seems to be that pluralism is, if anything, declining. And I therefore wonder how that reality is one that can really be addressed, much as we might wish to see it to be reversed. How can we actually bring it about? And secondly, what do you see as the implication of the huge number of displaced people? Jordan is in a particularly difficult and challenging place in the face of that. But the long-term implication of societies pulling apart and becoming more polarized strikes me as profound for the region. And what do you see as some of the implications of that?
Okay, hold those thoughts. One more question right here.
Thank you, Dr. Marwan. Always a pleasure to hearing you again and again. My question is about what do you think could be threats for the successful or for the struggling models to move ahead with their with advancing on the pluralism agenda, because it seems to, and more particularly, whether you see the changing geostrategic landscape in the region, i.e., whatever scenario arises from a re-engagement with Iran or not, and how the Gulf and in particular Saudi Arabia would react to the outcome of any re-engagement, success or failure of the re-engagement with Iran. Do you see that could be a threat or a game changer for the battle to pluralism? Because obviously, I mean, a scenario where Iran can re-emerge as a power in the region could be foreseen as a threat that could stifle, some would argue, the move or the demand for democracy, and would push for potentially a stronger authoritarian regime, whether either in the disengagement from reforms in the Gulf or in Egypt, basically hijacking Egypt more towards a less open position vis-a-vis to regaining its regional role. So do you see a link between the geostrategic changes in that region to the more domestic challenges that our societies in the Arab world are facing? Or do you see it complementary or a threat?
Pluralism has been, mentioned by you several times in this audience. You would think that pluralism as a concept is self-evident, that one should not even have to argue about it. Because if you look at the historical record, any society basically, almost any society which has progressed, is one that has endorsed and celebrated diversity. Societies that have not done so have actually withered. Take the Soviet Union as the most maybe contemporary example, all of Eastern Europe, etc. Societies who have advocated one-party rule, one version of the truth, have withered. Societies which have allowed for different thoughts, even thought that one disagrees with have actually flourished. The fact that today pluralism is debated, not just among this audience, but in the region, and I've been talking in the region often, pluralism is not self-evident in the region. Not everybody thinks that pluralism is the way to go. And a lot of people still think authoritarian rule is the answer. I mean, again, Sisi, 50 years after Nasser is dead, we are talking about, once again, the deification of the individual as a semi-god, providing the answers to all the problems of any one country. It's amazing. It really is amazing that no one is talking about building institutions. It's all about people. If we only have a strong leader, all our problems would be solved. And the irony is we've had strong leaders, and the problems were not solved. So it's amazing to me how I often find myself in a position to defend pluralism when it should be just self-evident. Well, it's such an easy concept. It's such a clear and where the historical record all over the world is overwhelming that prosperous, stable societies cannot flourish and renew themselves except through diversity.
And the question of the groups being spread all around, the refugees who are...
Okay. The impact is, look, we are still at the tip of the iceberg. The impact is going to be huge, particularly on Lebanon and Jordan. Let's start with Lebanon. Lebanon is a country where the demographic balance, is very delicate, and the excuse Lebanon often cited for not integrating Palestinians into their society, in other words, giving them citizenship, is that they would tip the balance in favor of the Sunni community because most of the Palestinians in Lebanon were Sunni or are Sunni. And they were talking about what the Lebanese say are 400,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Probably the figure is smaller than this. They now have to deal with 1 million plus Syrian refugees in a country of 4 million. So mostly Sunni. So the incorporation of the Syrian refugees into Lebanon is going to have huge demographic and political ramifications, which we have not started to see yet, but we will. Because as we know from experience in Jordan, these people are not going back. You look at the Iraqi refugees in Jordan, 300,000 people who came as a result of the Iraq War. 10 years ago, the Iraq War has been over for 10 years. None of them have come back. They are Jordanian in everything but nationality. Their children speak Jordanian. They go to Jordanian schools. Their culture has become Jordanian. What do you do with them? And then what do you do? Already Jordan has a very tense sort of debate about who is a Jordanian, between who is an East Jordanian and a Jordanian of Palestinian origin. Now you add to the mix 300,000 Iraqis and 1 million Syrians, the implications are huge. We haven't started even to feel them.
Let's take two more. One here and then one there. Okay.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asian Middle East Forum. I'm interested, what do you think of the role of Iran in the Gulf and the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia? They say that Saudi Arabia is very upset with the US because of the dialogue which is being developed between Iran and the US, and that the US may think that they can use the Iran in the Syrian situation. And what do you think about, lastly, the mindset of the Egyptian government in holding these Al Jazeera journalists?
And the one there?
Bahauddin Latif. It's first an observation, Sharia, which has been shown to be rather contested. Rather, there is a sort of dance of Sharias. There is the Saudi version of the Islamic Sharia and the Tunisian version of Islamic Sharia. And interestingly enough, the Tunisian version of Islamic Sharia has had to dance with the reality, which is that it's a country which is entirely dependent on tourism and goodwill of Western tourists. So it has to accommodate things like alcohol and all the other things that is required, to attract tourists. So I think they've had to sort of compromise on that issue, and I think Egyptian Islamicists possibly found that rather difficult to deal with. So certainly economy has a lot to do with, as you've mentioned, that economic reality is something that is affecting the Arab world more than other parts of the world, partly because oil money, cheap oil money, has been floating around for so long that I think you've forgotten the real world. The other point I was going to mention...
We don't have time for many points, I'm afraid. I think we better stop there. Let's just have the answers for...
Well, I'll start with the Sharia issue. I mean, when we talk about Sharia also, we have to be careful. What do we mean by Sharia? Is it a fixed set of laws? Is it written anywhere, exactly what Sharia is? Or are we talking about the principles of Sharia? Because there are many, even in Jordan, I mean, part of the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, are arguing that Sharia is only a set of principles, and they're not a set of detailed laws that one has to follow. So one has to be careful when we introduce notions like this. The poll that I mentioned, 47% want Sharia to be the only source. But do they really, what do they really mean by Sharia? Because most Muslims, when you talk about Sharia, think of it as the principles of the Muslim faith, rather than a detailed set of laws. Indeed, there is a problem between the Saudis and the Americans. Okay, over three issues basically: Iran, the nuclear issue of Iran, and Iran's basically, interference, involvement, whatever you want to call it, in the region is one major issue. The second issue is Syria. Okay, the Saudis want, of course, a more interventionist approach by the Americans in Syria. That is not happening. And the third issue is the Arab Spring. The Saudis want the United States to not to be on what they think is on the side of the Islamists in the Arab world. But a lot of people talk about this, meaning that the Saudi American relationship is therefore on a collision course. I don't think so, because the relationship is not limited to these three issues. There are a lot of other issues in which the Saudis and the Americans will have to cooperate. What has been missing is a candid discussion about all these issues and how to move forward. And I don't think one presidential visit by President Obama to Saudi Arabia is going to do it. They will have to talk more candidly about it. But I also think that the Saudis are worried, that a deal on the nuclear issue is going to mean a stronger Iranian role in the region, and they're worried about that. From an American perspective, President Obama badly wants a deal with Iran because he does not want to go to war with Iran. That, I think, is very clear. The Syrian issue has made it very, very clear that the American public do not want to go to war over any issue. And therefore, in the absence of going to war, the only discourse President Obama has is to try and forge a deal with Iran, which is not easy. It's not impossible, but it's not easy. And in which he is going to have to put a lot of cash in, a lot of political chip with his own Congress, and indirectly also with Israel over the issue of Iran. That is why, for example, I'm very pessimistic about the peace process, because I don't think that this is a priority for the president. His priority is a deal with Iran. He's not going to push Congress over the peace process when he also has to push them over an Iran deal. But I wouldn't go as far as saying that because of these differences that the Saudi-American relations are on a collision course. I don't think so.
And the Al Jazeera?
Sorry, what was the Al Jazeera?
What's the thinking behind the Egyptian government holding these journalists from Al Jazeera for so long? What's their purpose? What do you think they want to achieve?
I don't think this is limited to Al Jazeera journalists. You have 19,000 people in prison today in Egypt. It is correct too, and it is correct too. 19,000. I'm responsible for my. I have a friend, Amr Hamzawi, who is fiercely secular, who ran against the Islamists, in Egypt, who was one of 4 people only who won from the first round against the Islamists. And yet today, because he is speaking my language, in other words, the right of everybody to operate, he is not allowed to leave the country.
He's free and happy.
Well, a sober note. We've overrun our time, so I think we'll have to stop.
I'm sure you know that, Mr. Raj.
I think we could have a fairly polemic conversation till midnight. Thank you very much all for coming. I would like to thank very warmly Marwan Muasher for a masterful survey of the entire region, a very astute insight into all the challenges facing the Arab world in particular, and a very clever and detailed analysis in the book, which I urge you all to buy, of the underlying issues, particularly the question of pluralism and of education and of the things that are really the long-term challenges for the Arab world. I would just like to say I deeply admire the fact that having said all that, written all that, and thought all that, you can still remain an optimist. Thank you.